This tutorial is going to cover audio setup in CRYENGINE. We're going to cover adding ambient sounds, linking them to a changing time of day, adding audio triggers, linking sounds to actions like footsteps, shooting a gun, etc., and particle effects. If you go to our documentation page, docs.cryengine.com, go to the Learning section, Tutorials, and scroll down here, you will find the Audio Showcase tutorial. This is what I'm covering in this video. We have a level already created for you, and we have all the assets that you need. This is going to be a multi-part tutorial series because there's quite a bit of material covered as far as audio setup in CRYENGINE. To get started, you're going to need to download some assets. You can download the completely finished level and all the finished audio implementation, but if you're going to follow along with this tutorial and you want to do the steps and try and learn that way, then you're going to want to download the showcase audio source.zip. This zip file contains source files for 3 audio middlewares, SDL Mixer, Fmod Studio, and WWise, which we all support. You probably already know that SDL Mixer is free, but it's very simple. It doesn't support parameter passing. If you drill down into these tutorials, you'll see that in addition to the general information, at each section it branches off into specific instructions for Fmod, WWise, and SDL Mixer. In this video tutorial, I'm only going to cover Fmod because it's so widely used. SDL Mixer has limited functionality, and WWise is covered thoroughly in this written tutorial online if that's what you need help with. So let's get started. I'm going to be using CRYENGINE 5.5.2. You can also use later versions of CRYENGINE. I'm going to create a new project, and I'm going to use the C++ first-person shooter template. And call it whatever you like, or you can integrate this into your own existing project. Next thing is I need to download those assets through the tutorial documentation page into this project folder and then unzip them. So I'm going to use my gear icon here and say Reveal in Explorer to open up that folder window. And I'm going to go ahead and copy this path so that I have it, and go back to the main Audio Showcase documentation page and download the showcase audio source.zip file into that path that I just copied to the clipboard. And this is our project root folder. You'll notice that there's already assets in there with some things. Some of these we're going to be overwriting with our zip file. The zip file not only contains the showcase level without the audio setup yet, but it also includes some changes to the default setup, including deleting the reference to something called the .anim events from the player skeleton and setting up what's called sound obstruction within the surface types XML file. This is nothing that you need to worry about at this point. It'll all become clear as we go along. In the meantime, you'll also need to make sure that you have Fmod Studio installed. At the time I created this tutorial, CRYENGINE supports Fmod Studio 1.10, so that's what I'll be using. Once you've downloaded the showcase audio source files, which include the original audio, you also need to download the showcase level itself, which is right here, into that same folder. Once you have these 2 zip files downloaded, go find them in your project folder. I'm going to right-click, and I'm going to tell 7-zip to go ahead and extract them here. So the audio source.zip creates a folder called _audio assets, and that's where we're going to find our original .wave audio files that we'll be using in Fmod. Now we're going to go back and do the same thing with the showcase level.zip. And this one is going to ask to overwrite some existing files, as I said, in the assets folder, as well as adding some additional things, and go ahead and confirm that. The next thing we need to do is go back to our CRYENGINE project folder, and we're going to go down into Assets, Audio, and we're going to create a folder called Fmod, in my case. In your case, it may be WWise or SDL Mixer. And inside there, we need to make 2 subfolders. One is going to be for the CRYENGINE Audio Controls Editor, which is sometimes called the ACE, and the other one is going to be called Assets. Next, we want to go ahead and launch Fmod, and we need to create a new project. I'm going to go ahead and save it. And here's a big tip and a bit of a tricky thing to remember about the relationship between CRYENGINE and Fmod, and the same goes for WWise. We literally want to call our project Fmod_project, and we want to put it in this Assets Audio folder. What Fmod does is use the name that you select to create a folder by that name. So we're going to end up with a folder name called Fmod_project. We're going to end up with a .fspro file inside that folder called Fmod_project, and a whole bunch of subfolders that Fmod needs to track metadata and keep sound banks and events and all that stuff clear. If you literally name your project Fmod_project and put it in this Assets Audio folder in your CRYENGINE project, CRYENGINE will see it automatically. It creates this live link between the engine and Fmod, or between the engine and WWise. And that makes the whole workflow between Fmod and CRYENGINE really easy and transparent. So you're not hallucinating here. We literally want to name this project Fmod_project. And I want to change where Fmod is going to save its sound banks. So I'm going to go to the Edit menu and choose Preferences at the bottom. Click on the Build tab. And I'm going to use a relative path here in the Build panel where it says Built Banks Output Directory. I'm going to put Parent Folder and then Fmod. In this same Build tab, we're going to go to Project Platforms and click on this. And for this particular project, I'm going to be using a stereo mix instead of 5.1. Your project may be different, but for purposes of this tutorial, a stereo mix is what I'm going to reference in the instructions. And then the output subdirectory name needs to be that assets folder that we created. And then we're done with this preferences panel. Now if we go ahead and press the F7 key, we should generate what's called the master bank. If you get an error, then double check the settings that I just went through and make sure all the paths are correct. To confirm this, we're going to go back to this folder under my Assets, Audio, Fmod, and Assets folder, and we should see our masterbank.bank file. Finally, we're ready to open our CRYENGINE project. So there's a console variable, what we usually call a CVAR, that we need to set, which tells CRYENGINE to switch to a specific middleware. In my case, that's going to be Fmod. So in the console tool, I'm going to type s_audio IMPL name, implementation name, and then a space, and then your specific middleware. They all start with CRYEaudio IMPL, it's not case sensitive, and then the name of your middleware, or the abbreviation for it, Fmod, WWise, or SDL Mixer. Ultimately, you're going to need to make sure that this happens when your game is opened, when you're finished with it. So there are 3 places that you can actually put this. What I recommend is that you use this file called user.cfg in the root folder of your CRYENGINE project. If you're not able to edit the user.cfg file, check its properties and make sure that it's not read-only. If you open this up in a text editor, we can add the line that we just typed in CRYENGINE. You can copy and paste the CVAR and the value set it to straight from the CRYENGINE console. However, you do need to add an equal sign. And again, this is not case sensitive. You'll just find that we usually do initial caps to make this easier to read. Go ahead and save that and close. So now every time we start the engine in the editor or in game, your particular audio middleware will automatically be enabled. If you look in the documentation under console variables, you'll find this page that thoroughly explains how to set console variables on game start and when starting the sandbox. Now that we have that much done, we're ready to open our showcase level. I'm going to go File, Open. Go to the Levels folder and open the Showcase Audio level. So I'm going to put this in full screen mode for a second and just take a look around. You'll see that this is a fairly contained and small scale, low poly style level. There are a bunch of walkways for the player to walk around, some bridges. In the middle is a campfire, which is one of the first things we're going to use to motivate sounds. On the far side of the level is a marketplace, even though there are no characters in it, and that's also going to be a motivation for some sound design, pretending that people are shopping in the marketplace. Outside the boundary of the city walls is a forest, which will be our third source of motivation for sound design, forest sounds, wind through the trees, etc. And then there are just some very low poly mountains surrounding the level so that we don't see the edges of it. If you go to the Tools menu, you want to open the Audio Controls Editor. If you're brand new to the Audio Controls Editor, I'm not going to be doing any kind of introduction to it per se. If you do want to have a little bit more of an introduction to the ACE, then I suggest that you go to our YouTube channel, youtube.com/CRYENGINE, and go to our Flappy Boyd Beginners course, Chapter 11. And within a short time there, you'll get a very thorough introduction on setting up audio, in that case using SDL Mixer, but the principles are the same, and the role of the ACE is the same. Okay, so we're ready to create our first sound bank in Fmod. We've created the sound for you to use for this, and it's in the _audio assets folder under Fmod Studio in my case, or whatever middleware that you're using. And we're in the Chapter 1 tutorial. And the sound that we're going to be using is this playgunfire1.wave. If you want to go ahead and open it and preview it, that's what it sounds like. It's very short and sweet. So to create our first sound bank, you want to drag this wave file from your Explorer window into the left panel here of the Events tab in Fmod. So I'm literally going to drag this file, drop it over here. Fmod will tell you that it's going to be copied, and you'll get prompted to tell it whether to create a 2D event or a 3D event. A 3D event is able to be positioned in the user's sound field, in the soundscape of their headphones or their speaker setup. The reason that we're going to use a 2D event from the gunfire is I'm using a first-person shooter template, and the gun is always in my hands, directly where the player is, very close to his or her ears, so I literally just want the sound placed where the player is. Now that we've defined the event, we need to create an actual sound bank. The sound banks store additional metadata related to these audio assets, as well as containing a compressed, encrypted version of the original audio files. So in other words, we don't directly play these source wave files in the engine. So we're going to click on the Banks tab in Fmod. I'm going to right-click in this panel and select New Bank, and just give it a name. In this case, I'm going to call it Weapon. I'm going to save my Fmod project. I'm going to switch back to the Events tab here, and you'll notice this little hashtag next to my new event, which says Unassigned, which is just a reminder that though you've created the event, you haven't associated it with a sound bank yet. So let's go ahead and do that. I'm going to right-click on this event, and I'm going to select Assign to Bank, and assign it to that weapon bank that I just created. And now I'm ready to go actually build my banks, which again is F7. You can also do it under the File menu, Build. Should look for no errors happening there. Next, we want to go back to the engine and create an audio trigger for it there. Now, if we come back to the Audio Controls Editor, you may need to refresh, but you should see the sound bank that we created. You should see the sound bank that we created in the Banks folder, and you should see the event that we created in the Events folder. So what we need to do now is create a library. I'm going to right-click in the Controls panel over here in the ACE and say Add Library. And I'm going to create a separate library just for the weapon. And I'm going to drag the event, not the bank, but the event, into that library. And I'm going to get a green icon next to it, which indicates that it's a trigger. If you right-clicked on a library and went to the Add menu, you see all the different kinds of things that Fmod and CRYENGINE support, and trigger is one of them. One of the things that you'll notice there is something called a preload. And that actually refers to the fact that any sound that needs to be readily available to trigger at any moment in your game needs to have been preloaded into memory. Loading things off a disk drive just takes way too long compared to memory. So on game start, anything that needs to be ready to play needs to be preloaded. So I'm going to right-click and add another library just called Preloads. And I'm going to drag the bank into there. And you'll see that it gets this blue icon, which is a preload icon. At this point, I need to save all the changes to my libraries, which is a separate thing from saving the level. Control-S in the sandbox does not save changes to the ACE libraries. You'll also notice this dialog box comes up and says, hey, there's been some new information communicated from Fmod or WWise. You should refresh this before you save, and you can go ahead and say yes. I also could have done this manually by clicking on this refresh button and then clicking on the Save All Changes button. If I want to test this, I can right-click on my trigger and say Execute Trigger. And there's my sound. Now, if you're not happy with the volume of a trigger here in the engine, you don't adjust that in the engine. You're going to do that back in your audio middleware. So if we go back to Fmod, I can use the spacebar to preview it once I have the sound event selected. And if I want to adjust the volume, that's this guy right here. If I want to reset it to 0, I can double-click it. Don't forget to save and rebuild your sound banks with F7 or File, Build. And don't forget to reload the audio engine back in the Audio Controls Editor to get the updated data from your middleware. Next, we're going to add the sound of tree movements. If you look back in that same Audio Assets folder, you'll see 4 variations on the sound of moving leaves. We're going to use all 4 of them randomly selected within a single 3D event in Fmod. From the Fmod menu, select Window, Audio Bin. The Audio Bin is where you'll find the raw audio assets listed. To keep things organized, I'm going to create a folder by right-clicking here, and I'm going to call it Ambience. You can call it anything you like. And within that folder, right-clicking on that, I'm going to create another folder called One-Shots. In other words, sounds that don't loop continuously. And I'm going to go back to my window here and drag these 4 audio assets into that One-Shots folder. Then I'm going to go back to this Events tab, and just as we did before, I'm going to create a folder for this event. I'm going to right-click, choose New Folder. I'm going to call it Ambience, and just as I did within the audio bin, I'm going to create a subfolder inside that called One-Shots. Now I'm going to take these 4 audio assets that we've added and drag them into this event folder. And all 4 of them are going to be combined into what Fmod calls a 3D event, specifically a multi-instrument, which means we have parallel tracks running at the same time, and Fmod will automatically randomly choose from amongst those variations. I'm going to double-click this event and rename it. Whatever naming scheme is meaningful to you. You'll notice again the unassigned hashtag. If you press the spacebar to test this and press the spacebar to stop again, you don't have to bother listening to the whole thing. You'll notice that each time it randomly selects from amongst those 4 variations. I'm just pressing spacebar to start playing and then spacebar to stop again. Now we're going to go to the Banks tab, and again we're going to create a new bank called Ambience. And here I need to get that event into that bank. So I'm going to drag this 3D event onto the Banks tab, hold the cursor down until it activates, and then drag it into my Ambience bank. I'm going to save all my changes, and F7 or File Build. Now we can switch back to the Audio Controls Editor in CRYENGINE. And now you'll notice that you've got a new folder called Ambience under Events, and then One Shots, and there's our new 3D event. So we need to connect this to a CRYENGINE audio trigger. I'm going to right-click over here in the Controls panel and add another library. Probably already guessed, I'm going to call it Ambience. Right-click on my Ambience library and add a new folder inside it, and I'm going to call this One Shot. Next, I'm going to drag my new event from the One Shots folder over into this folder here to create a new trigger. Once again, any sound that is going to be playable needs to be preloaded. So I'm also going to drag my Ambience bank into my preloads library, and I should get a blue icon there. I'm going to go ahead and save and refresh. Now that we have a trigger for our tree sounds, we're ready to create an audio trigger spot to actually trigger them in the level. The first thing is to select which layer you want to put it in. I'm going to double click on the global audio level to make it the current layer. I'm going to go to Create Object, Audio, double click on Audio Trigger Spot, and because this is 2D, it doesn't matter where I put it. I'm just going to put it wherever is handy. And the first thing I want to do is go ahead and assign the actual trigger, and that is the Play Trigger property. And there in the Ambience library, in the One Shot folder, we have our Play Tree Movement sound. Now you'll note an important property here, which is under Play Mode, we have something called Behavior, and by default it's set to single, which means it's just going to trigger once. If we want this thing to reoccur, we're going to choose Trigger Rate and tell the engine how often to trigger this. So this is supposed to be in seconds, but in CRYENGINE 5.5.2 you need to express it in milliseconds. If you're using 5.6 or later, this is in seconds. So for instance, I could set this to 20,000 milliseconds, which would mean every 20 seconds, this sound triggers again. And if you listen carefully now, you will hear the sound playing in the background and randomizing between the 4 different variations every time it triggers. So that is all the steps for this first audio tutorial, which is creating some basic ambience. In the next tutorial, we're going to assign sounds to the footsteps of the player, synchronized as it walks.